Okay, welcome everyone to my continuation of what are my favorite theorems. As usually, right? My favorite theorems, so take everything with a grain of salt. In particular, today I had a pretty hard choice to make, or at least in some sense. So what I decided to talk about today is Goodstein's theorem, and there's a very similar theorem which is much more well known. It's called Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and they're kind of the same flavor. And I needed to pick one of them. I decided for Goodstein theorem because it's actually much more explicit. It's pretty nice, but it's very much like Gödel's incompleteness theorem. If you don't know what Gödel's incompleteness theorem is, I will comment on that later. But for now, let's just have a look at this Goodstein's theorem. Very good. And the idea is the following. So I have something that's called the Goodstein sequence. And this is a ridiculously fast growing sequence. So let's have a look how it works. So here already it grows ridiculously fast. So I already have a 10 to the whatever, 30,000. That doesn't matter anymore. Well, 10 is a huge number. And it works as follows, and I call it G. Okay, and I will make it even more explicit in a second. But for now, this is a original formulation due to Goodstein. It must have been in the 40s of the last century. So about 80 years ago, if you're watching this in 2021, of course. Um, and it basically is very easy. So G1 is just you pick your favorite number, M. So you have a starting value and you just initiate everything by the first value is your starting value. Very good. Pick your favorite starting value. Here down here, I've chosen to pick, well, whatever, 35. And now comes the fun part. So let's say you already know a certain value, so it's recursively defined. Then you write this number in hereditary base n. I will explain what that is in a second. And you replace all n that appear by n plus 1. And this just really blows up the sequence. It just makes it huge. We'll see that in a second. And I call this growth. And what you can do then, and it looks very innocent, but actually it's a crucial step here, is that you subtract 1. And I call this cut. Right? So you let it grow by quite a lot and you subtract 1. You let it grow by quite a lot, you subtract 1. And the question you would like to ask is, because you always subtract 1, so will this ever hit 0? And it really looks like it doesn't want to. But before I can explain that, let me explain what I mean by this hereditary base n notation. So here's an easy Mathematica demonstration linked in the description below, how this actually works. So this is how it works. You have a number 266, for example, and you can vary the number, as you can see. So whatever, let's start with 1. And you choose your base, and for 1, nothing changes, but basically you can choose an arbitrary base. So that was the n in my notation before. Let's say base is 2. And you write your number basically only using 2s, okay, or numbers that are lower than 2. So I can write run as 1. That's easy. 2 is 2. 3 is 1 plus 2. So you're only allowed to use numbers that are lower or equal to 2. 4 is 2 squared. 5 is 2 squared plus 1. 2 squared plus 2. 2 squared plus 2 plus 1. And so on. Right? You're only allowed to write ever numbers that are less or equal to 2. For example, 16 is 2 to the 4, of course, but 4, you have to replace 4 again by 2 to the 2. And that's why it's called hereditary base, base something notation, base n notation, because you really replace every appearance. Every appearance of a number that is bigger than 2, you would, in this case, you would replace it by an according expression. And you know all of them basically because you have seen them before, right? You hit everything by induction. And you can go on, and that's usually how those numbers look like. So whatever. This is an example of an hereditary base 2 notation for whatever this number is. 594,474. And as you can see, the only numbers you ever see are 2s and well, everything lower than 2. You can do this in base whatever, in base 34. And for example, this is 33 times 34, which is totally fine because 33 is lower than 34 and 34 is lower than 34 squared and so on, right? You can do this. And 34 is maybe a little bit too big, so let's do whatever, 9, and you can do it very big. And you see those numbers. If you do it smaller, something like 5. And as you can see, those numbers, if you have the right powers here, those numbers grow really rapidly. But let's go back to 2. So here's an example, right? 2 to the 2 to the 2 to the 2, for example. That's what you would need to write in, because you have to replace every appearance of whatever, bigger numbers by 2s, basically. Okay, back to business, and that's what I did here. So in this step, I write 35 as it's according hereditary base 2 expression. So it's 2 to the 2 to the 2 to the 1, plus 2 to the 1 plus 1. And I make it clear that this is kind of this tower notation. You go from top to bottom. So this is, so for example, 5 to the 5 to the 5 is a pretty huge number. It's you first evaluate 5 to the 5, and then you take this one to the 5th power. So those numbers grow very fast. And in the growth step, what you do is you replace all appearance of 2s by 3s. So it's 3 to the 3 to the 3 to the 1 plus 3 to the 1 plus 1. And by construction, because you only create number 1 bigger, but that's now your hereditary base 3 notation, basically. That's a good number. That's some number that is much, much bigger than the number you started with. Like in this case, you get something along, well, I don't even know how to pronounce this number. It's huge, some huge number. So you have a grow process. So growing really blows up your number because you replace everything by a bigger power of a bigger power of a bigger power of a bigger power. You get the point. And then you have this innocent looking cut. You just subtract 1. And this really seems like it's doing nothing, but the subtracting 1 is really the crucial step. And then you continue. You express the next number you see, this one here, you take it, you express it base 3, you grow by replacing everything with 4s, and you get a number that is so ridiculously big. I wasn't even able to fit it on the screen. Instead of, well, in digits, I mean, I really need to write something like it's roughly 10 to the 100 and whatever. you continue, take this number, you continue, you grow, right? Replace every 4 by a 5. You cut, you remove 1, and you get a number that is ridiculously huge, and you continue. And the question is whether the sequence ever hits 0. It looks like this goes to infinity, and very, 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 very quickly. It goes really very quickly. It grows really very quickly, but it doesn't go to infinity. Eventually, it will hit 0. So eventually, this function becomes constant 0, and that's called Goodstein's theorem. And that's a very surprising statement about the sequence, which seems to grow very fast. But there is another aspect of this Goodstein sequence, which I'm going to explain later. But before that, I would like to give you a kind of equivalent formulation, which is easier to remember and doesn't use numbers. Well, we'll come back to this later, but basically it's a statement about numbers, but made in a kind of visually appealing way. And it's called the Hydra Game, and it goes back to Kirby-Paris. It must have been the 80s of the last century, so it's already a while ago, but certainly not as long ago as Goodstein itself. And it's basically a game, and you try to kill the Hydra, right? The legendary Hydra of Lerna, right? We're just in mathematics, so the Hydra is a tree. So this is a Hydra, and I will explain this. So I took this picture actually from this huge picture here, actually from the original paper. It's pretty clear, so there's absolutely no way to make it better. As the resolution is a little bit bad because it was a paper from the 80s, and I think the resolution for pictures just wasn't really good. But if we ignore this, this is basically the optimal way to explain this game. So you can read it up here, but let me just say it in words. So a hydra is a rooted tree. So we have a root, and the root always stays below, and the tree is just a graph without cycles. So this is a tree. So and that's your starting tree. Let's call it X, whatever, doesn't matter. And every hydra has a root. That's basically the body of the hydra, and it has heads. And the heads are just the last sticking out pieces of this tree, right? It's a tree. You have chosen a root. You can think of it like a tree, like growing up, and you have those last sticking out things that you just call heads. That's a hydra. Right? Now imagine that this is kind of a snake-like hydra thing that you all know, and these are really the hats. And now you're kind of the hero, and you're allowed in each step to cut off one of the hats of the hydra. So in this case, I would like to cut off this hat. And the hydra is a mean beast. So whenever you cut off one of its hats, it will copy, it will grow more hats. It's a growing process. So cutting off is, of course, the cut here. Growing is a growth from the Goodstein sequence, and it works now as follows. So you have cut it off the head. I'll show you more examples in a second. You've cut it off the head at this point. So you go 1 point lower, and you look what remains. And it's now maybe I do it this way. And in this case, it's a thing that looks like this, and you just copy it. And depending on what step you are, that's the number of copies you put. So in the first step, you just copy it once, right? This is, let's say, is the original, and this is a copy, and the rest stays the same. Okay, so you chop off a hat, and the hydra grows new hats depending on a certain rule, and it grows a lot of hats, as you can see here, depending on this rule. So let's have another example. So you chop off this hat, and you look down here. Sorry, one up. Here is the base. So you look down here, one down, and this is the thing you copy. And because you're now in the next step, the second step, you put 2 copies of it. So here's copy 1, and here's copy 2, and here's the original, right? And you keep on going. You chop off something here. You look at this point, you see, there's a lot of things going on, and you get a new, bigger copy. And this hydra seems to grow and grow and grow and grow, and you're basically just chopping off one head at once. And the question then becomes to, can you kill the hydra, basically? Can you chop off heads until it's just a root, right? Or until only the body is left. And it doesn't, I don't know how you feel, but to me, this doesn't feel, this just can't work, right? I mean, you chop off a hat, I'll show you another example in a second. You chop off a hat, and it just grows so many more hats, and depending on in what step you are, it just explodes. It's exactly the same as here, and depending on what step you are, this replaces whatever, a 4 by a 5 or a 100 by a 101, and because everything is formulated in terms of powers, this just ridiculously huge. But actually, you can kill the hydra, and that is reasonably easy to see. So let's have a look. So here, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and the hydra that you see at the bottom is already pretty huge, but I'm going to explain why it's still pretty clear that you can kill it at one point. It just takes you a very long time. So let's have a look again. So here's my hydra, it's this tree, and I chop off this head, and I look, I've here in red, I have marked the parts of the hydra that I like to copy, and I copy it in blue, right? So the red is the original one. It stays here, and because I'm at step 1, I put a blue copy next to it. Okay. You chop off another head, and so this one, this is marked here, dotted. You look at the next one, and you copy it. It stays where it is, and the hydra copies it now 2 times because you're in the next step, and so on. So if this would be step 20, then the hydra would regrow 20 of those copies. But now comes the point. Whenever you chop off something at the bottom, there's this one extra thing that happens. In this case, the hydra doesn't grow anything new anymore. So instead of, so this is one extra rule, which I haven't said until now. Whenever this the whole thing is the part you would like to copy. The Hydra doesn't copy it because it can't copy its body. Okay, you would need to grow exactly the same thing once more, but that's not happening. Okay, the Hydra doesn't grow anymore. So this process really just removes a -1. And that's the whole point. This is why this works. And what you kind of think that you have this huge tree and you have all these branching points everywhere, and you kind of need to chop things until you get down to the root, because if you chop at the root, you can just chop them off one by one. And so basically, let's have a look at the next step, then you see what's going on. So now this is my Hydra, and I decide to chop off this head. Okay, I look at what remains, I copy it. So this is the one that remains now. I copy it whatever how many times. Step 4, I get all this crap here. But they are all at the root. And I don't need to worry about them anymore. I can chop them off at one point. It just takes me a long time because there are quite a few of them, but they won't regrow. So actually, was a good step. And you could continue now. As you can see, you can chop here, you get a lot of copies. You can chop here, you get a lot of copies. You can chop here and you get more of those things. But then you can chop them exactly in the same way as before. So kind of what's happening here is you have this tree, and in the leaf part, it might be very dense, and you kind of chop off everything from the leaf, and it grows things very quickly, and a lot of them, but always lower. You always go lower in a certain order type of sense. So if you ignore that there are a lot of vertices after a certain step, so if you ignore, so let's have a look here, if you ignore that those numbers are really big, so I'm kind of saying you shouldn't look at those numbers, right? They're just really big, but look at the expressions. The expressions get simpler in some sense, right? So I started here with the 3 to the 3 to the 3 to the 1 plus 3 to the 1. And my chopping process at one point brought me down to 6 to the 6 to the 6 to the 1 plus 1. And that's an easier expression. So for example, instead of 3, you could just write a random symbol like omega to the omega to the omega to the 1. And then the upstairs expression would be, this is the 1. The upstairs expression would be something like this. And the later expression, kind of an omega is an infinite thing that doesn't change, would be omega to the omega to the omega, oh, to the 1, sorry. But this already has gone down. And this is basically what happens. You should look at the numbers themselves. You should look at the expressions. You shouldn't be worried too much that the Hydra grows a lot of different. So here you can also see it, a lot of different hats. No, it's in some sense simpler, because here you started off with 3 coming out at one vertex, and you've reduced that already to at most 2 coming out at the top vertices. And that's really what kills the Hydra in the end. Right? So, but now comes the theorem. And the theorem then is very, very, very surprising. I think I convinced you up to this point that you can kill the Hydra. Also, it doesn't really look like it. But the theorem is actually stronger. The theorem itself is you will always kill the Hydra. So there is, whatever kind of strategy you use to cut off the hats, you will always kill it. Okay, that's already surprising. Like you can do very silly moves. It doesn't matter. The Hydra will grow and grow and grow, but at one point you will kill it, no matter what hat you decide to chop off. That's already a very surprising statement. So you will always kill it. You will always win. And another formulation would be every strategy is a winning strategy. So you can't lose this game. And I think that's really surprising. But now comes an even more surprising statement. The proof is really easy. So Wikipedia, the Wikipedia page linked in the description, actually has a proof. It's not very hard. You basically did what I already explained. You write omegas instead of actually numbers, and then you worry kind of later what omegas are. And you will see that in this omega expression, things get easier. So there's a getting easier procedure, and basically that implies that you will kill the Hydra at one point. But this kind of trick of writing this infinite expression omega is just something that doesn't work in classical arithmetic. So this is a statement which actually is true. As I said, you can prove it. but it's not provable in classical arithmetic. And because classical arithmetic, I really mean, if you know what that means, it means piano arithmetic. So you really need to have some infinity argument built in, some argument involving infinities. You cannot prove this statement in finite arithmetic. That's basically what it is. And that's a very surprising thing. So you have a statement which is obviously about numbers if you would formulate it in this terms, and really the Hydra game is equivalent. But if you state it in this terms, it's just a statement about a sequence of numbers. And it's easy to see in all examples you will ever compute. Well, the numbers get really big, but in all examples you will ever compute, it's pretty easy to see that this will converge to zero, right? You kill the Hydra, means the sequence gets zero at one point. But this is just not provable without using methods involving infinity. So it's not provable in classical arithmetic. And this is a really shocking statement, because there is a statement, I say it again because it's very important, there is a statement which is actually true, and you can prove that you can't prove it. Okay? You can prove that there is a statement that is true that you can't prove. And that's just amazing. You can prove it, as I said, in using infinities in stronger numbers system axioms, but in classical arithmetic, piano arithmetic, whatever, you just can't prove it. A very, very simple statement about numbers that you just can't prove. And more, you can prove that you can't prove it. So that's why I like this Goodstein theorem so much, or whatever you want to call it, the Kirby-Paris Hydra game. The Kirby-Paris Hydra game is, as I said, basically equivalent. It's just a very, very nice and clear, visually clear formulation. It's like a little bit like game theoretical formulation or combinatorial formulation. Anyway, let me say it again. There is a statement in number theory that you can't prove using methods of number theory. That's basically what I said. And coming back to where I started at the beginning, this is kind of an explicit version of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Gödel's incompleteness theorem is a bit more general. It says something like, in any reasonable axiom system, there will be a statement that you can't prove within your axiom system. So this is kind of a very general statement. What makes this theorem nicer is that usually if you do some Gödel type of arguments, most of these non-provable statements are more like meta-mathematical statements. So Gödel originally, what he did was he found a way to formulate the liar paradox. I am lying in formal language. So this is really an explicit version of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. That's why I prefer it in some sense. Gödel is different; they're not equivalent. But this is, I would like to think of it like an explicit version of Gödel's theorem. And just to finish, as I told you, this Goodstein sequence eventually hits zero. And it would be interesting to know at what stage it hits zero, right? So I just made a list, and this list is well known. I haven't made it myself. For basically the first 12 numbers as my starting value. This was my m from before. So the m from here, I have this initiation. I have to fix a starting value, and it's easy to see. Well, I did it for 2 here, so it hits 0 after 4 steps. You only see 3 steps because keep in mind my initiation is actually an extra step. So secretly down here are 4 steps, and it starts very well. We could pause the video and have a look. It's very easy. Okay, you do it yourself. So the first few are very easy and they terminate very, very quickly. As soon as you hit in 4, things get a little bit messy, and you get this number which has quite a few digits, which I can't even write down anymore. Well, of course I can write it down in the scientific notation, but it's too big to just write it as a string of numbers. 5 is so ridiculously big, I don't even know what to say anymore. And just for the lovers of big numbers, at start value 12, you hit 0 after a number which is bigger than this famous Graham's number, which is just a very huge number. I link it in the description if you don't know what it is. It's just a very huge number. It doesn't really matter if you don't know it, because just looking at this number, scares me at least a lot. So as this grows ridiculously fast, but still you will kill the Hydra because of this very innocent I cut off a hat procedure I subtract one. Yeah, anyway, I should stop waffling and let me just repeat why I like this theorem so much. Because first of all, it has a very surprising statement, like you always win. And second of all, it has an even more surprising statement that you basically can't prove it, uh, strictly speaking, within some given axiom system like Peano arithmetic. And it's an explicit version of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope to see you next time.